The job posting didn't say much. Night technician, audio preservation, contract through the end of the year, references preferred but not required. That last part is what I noticed. When a place says references aren't required, it usually means they're having trouble keeping people, and I wasn't in a position to be picky about why a job was open. I'd been out of steady work for 14 months. My unemployment had run out in the spring, and I'd spent the summer doing whatever I could find, which was mostly nothing. By October, I was 3 weeks behind on rent and screening calls from a number I'd memorized, so I'd know not to answer it. So when a man named Albrecht called me back the same afternoon I applied, I said yes before he'd finished describing the position. I would have said yes to almost anything. The place was called the Heartline Sound Recovery Institute, though that name made it sound far grander than it was. It was a former telephone exchange building on the east edge of a town I'd only ever driven through. The kind of town where the main industry had closed 30 years ago, and everything since had been people figuring out what to do with the buildings left behind. The exchange was 4 stories of dark brick with narrow windows, set back from the road behind a parking lot that had more weeds than asphalt. A small sign by the door, hand-lettered on what looked like an old drafting board, said HSR1 in faded blue. And under it, in smaller letters, Archival Audio Restoration Preservation. I want to be honest about something before I go any further, because it matters how the rest of this went. I am not a careful person. I lose things. I forget names. I have a habit of nodding along when someone explains a procedure to me, so they think I've understood, when really I've absorbed about half of it and plan to figure out the rest as I go. This has gotten me in trouble before, and it got me in trouble at Heartline, and I won't pretend otherwise. Whatever you think of me by the end, I'd ask you to remember that the man who took that job was tired and broke and not paying as close attention as he should have been. I keep thinking that if I'd been sharper at the start, I'd have caught the shape of it sooner. Maybe I'd have left. Probably not, but maybe. Albrecht met me at the door for the interview. He was older than his voice on the phone, maybe 65. With reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a cardigan that had been mended at one elbow with a slightly wrong shade of brown. He shook my hand and looked at me a second longer than felt comfortable, then said, "You're punctual. Good. Punctual matters more here than most places." Inside, the building smelled like old paper and machine oil, and something underneath those two that I couldn't place at first, a cool mineral smell, like the inside of a basement that floods sometimes. The lobby had a reception desk with nobody at it, a wall of small wooden mailbox slots left over from whenever the building had been something else, and a bulletin board with a single laminated sheet pinned to it that I didn't read. Albrecht walked me down a hallway lit by fluorescent tubes, half of which were out. So we passed through stretches of bright light, and then dim, and then bright again. The floor was that speckled industrial linoleum that you only ever see in buildings put up before about 1970, worn pale in a path down the center where decades of feet had walked. He talked the whole way, and I caught most of it. The Institute, he said, restored old audio recordings. Wax cylinders, lacquered discs, magnetic wire, reel-to-reel tape, anything that held sound and had degraded past the point where ordinary equipment could play it. Museums sent them things. Universities, private collectors, estates, the occasional government records office clearing out a storage room. The work was slow and specialized, and most of it happened during the day, when the senior restorers were in. My job, the night job, was different. My job was monitoring. "We run long transfers overnight," he said. "Some of these recordings can only be played once before the medium fails completely. You get one pass. So when we transfer them, we record everything: the audio, the machine's behavior, temperature, humidity, and the speed of the playback motor. If a transfer is running and something goes wrong, We need a person there to log it and stop the machine before it destroys the original. That's you. You sit, you watch the meters, you keep the log, and you don't touch the recordings themselves. The restorers handle those. You handle the room. It sounded easy. It sounded, honestly, like getting paid to stay awake, which after 14 months of getting paid nothing to do anything, sounded fine. He took me up to the 3rd floor in an elevator that moved so slowly I thought it had stopped twice. The 3rd floor was where the night work happened. There was a long room he called the transfer room, with 4 workstations, each one a heavy desk loaded with equipment that spanned about 80 years of technology. Some of it was clearly modern computers, external drives, a rack of black metal boxes with green and red lights. But mixed in with those were machines I didn't recognize at all. Old things with brass fittings and bakelite knobs and reels the size of dinner plates. The whole room hummed at a pitch I felt more than heard. "You'll mostly work at Station 2, Albrecht said. "It's set up for the overnight queue. The other stations are for the day staff." He showed me the log. It was a physical book, not a computer file, which surprised me. A big cloth-bound ledger with ruled columns, and the columns were labeled in a way that took me a while to understand. Source ID, medium, start time, motor speed, anomaly, action, initials. The book was maybe a third full. The entries before mine were written in several different hands, and I remember thinking the most recent ones got shorter and shorter the closer they came to the blank pages, like whoever had been writing them had less and less to say. "Every transfer gets a line," Albrecht said. "Every line gets your initials. If nothing happens during a transfer, you write nominal in the anomaly column. If something happens, you describe it, briefly. We're not writing essays. We're keeping a record." "What counts as something happening?" I asked. He thought about that for a moment. "You'll know it when you hear it," he said, which I would later understand was the most honest answer he could have given me. And at the time, I took for the kind of thing a manager says when he doesn't want to write a real job description. My trainer for the first week was a man named Petrosian. He was somewhere in his 50s, heavy-set with a gray mustache and the patient, slightly defeated manner of a person who has explained the same thing to a lot of people and watched most of them quit. He'd worked the night shift at Heartline for 11 years, he told me, which I found hard to believe, because the job he described did not sound like something a person could do for 11 years without losing their mind. The first night, he made coffee in a machine that was older than I was, in a break room that had a refrigerator held shut with a bungee cord and a microwave with a handwritten sign taped to it that said, "Does not work. Do not report." I asked about the sign. Petrosian said someone had reported the microwave broken 3 years ago, and the report had generated so much paperwork that the staff had collectively decided to never report anything broken again, and that this was, more or less, the philosophy of the entire building. "You'll see," he said. "Stuff breaks here. You don't report it. You work around it. You report something. You get Albrecht and a form and a vendor who shows up 6 weeks later. Faster to just live with it." The coffee was terrible. I want to mention the coffee because it became one of the few stable things in my night. The way a bad routine can be a comfort. It tasted burnt and slightly metallic, like the water came through old pipes, which it probably did. I drank 4 cups a night, minimum. By the end, I think the coffee was the only thing keeping me sitting in that chair. And I don't entirely mean that as a figure of speech. Petrosian walked me through the actual work, and the actual work was simple. At the start of the shift, there'd be a transfer queued at Station 2 by the day staff. A source, a cylinder, a disc, a spool of wire, whatever already loaded into the appropriate machine, with a card clipped to the station that listed the source YD and the medium and any special notes. My job was to start the transfer at the time written on the card, watch the meters while it ran, write down anything unusual, and stop the machine if the source started to fail. Most transfers ran between 40 minutes and 2 hours. On a typical night, there'd be 3 or 4 of them, with gaps in between where I had nothing to do but sit and listen to the building. "You listen to the transfer?" I asked. There was a pair of heavy headphones at the station, the old kind with thick padding. Petrosian gave me a look I didn't understand until much later. "You can," he said. "You don't have to. The machine records whether you listen or not. Some guys listen, some don't." He paused. "If you listen, there's a rule about it. I'll get to the rules." "The rules?" He said it like that, with a weight on it, and then he poured himself more of the terrible coffee and sat down across from me and told me the rules, and they sounded so mundane that I almost laughed. There were 5 of them. He'd written them out for me on an index card, in pencil, in handwriting that pressed hard enough to dent the card. I still have that card. It's in front of me right now. The first rule was, start every transfer at the exact time on the card, not before, not after. He explained that the day staff scheduled the transfers based on the building's electrical load and the temperature cycle of the equipment, and that starting early or late could damage the source. I believed this. It made sense. It was the kind of rule that had an obvious, boring engineering reason behind it. The second rule was, if a transfer finishes and the card lists a second source, do not load it yourself. Leave it for the day staff. He said the night tech wasn't trained to handle the originals, which was true, and that touching a source could ruin it, which was also true. Fine, easy. The third rule was, if you listen to a transfer, do not respond to it. He said this one carefully, watching me. I asked what he meant and responded to it. He said sometimes, on old recordings, especially the very old ones, there are voices, and the voices can sound like they're talking to you, like they're asking you something or saying your name. He said it's a known thing in audio restoration, that the brain is wired to hear speech in noise, that it's called pareidolia, the same reason you see faces in clouds. He said it would happen, and when it happened, I shouldn't talk back, not even to myself, not even a what. Just log it and keep working. I remember nodding along to this the way I nod along to everything, half listening. And Petrosian must have seen that, because he leaned forward and said, I mean it. You'll think it's nothing. Everybody thinks it's nothing. Just don't do it. It's the easiest rule to follow because it costs you nothing. So just follow it. The fourth rule was, keep the door to the transfer room closed during a transfer, and keep the door to the east stairwell closed always. The east stairwell, he said, led down to the lower levels, which were closed, which were full of old exchange equipment and water damage, and were generally not safe. And the door stuck and was a fire hazard, and nobody was supposed to go down there. I said okay. I had no desire to go into a closed, water-damaged basement in the middle of the night. The fifth rule was the one that stuck with me, then and now, because it was the only one that didn't have an obvious reason attached to it. The fifth rule was, the phone at Station 1 does not work. If it rings, do not answer it. Write down the time and continue. I looked over at Station 1. There was a phone on it, an old desk model, beige plastic gone yellow with age, with a rotary dial and a cloth-covered cord. It looked like it belonged in a museum, which I suppose it did. It was not plugged into anything. I could see the cord trailing off the back of the desk and ending in a frayed stub, no jack, no wall connection. It was just an old phone, sitting on a desk. The kind of thing that ends up in a place like this, because nobody ever throws anything away. That phone's not connected to anything, I said. No, Petrosian said. It's not. So how would it ring? He looked at me, and there was something tired in his face. Something that I read at the time as the ordinary tiredness of a man who's worked nights for 11 years, but which I now think was a different kind of tiredness entirely. It rings sometimes, he said. Maybe once a week, maybe less. You write down the time and you keep working, and it stops, that's all. It's the easiest part of the job. I asked him why an unplugged phone would ring, and he said something about the wiring in the building being a mess, about induced current, about how the old exchange had miles of copper still running through the walls, and sometimes it picked up a charge and old phones were sensitive to that. It was a reasonable-sounding explanation. It used the right words. I accepted it completely, because I wanted to, because I needed the job. And a job where the worst thing that happened was an old phone occasionally ringing sounded like the best job I'd had in a year. That was my first night. We didn't run any transfers. Petrosian said the queue was light, and he wanted to spend the time training me, so I never actually did the work, just learned about it. He showed me how to start a transfer, how to read the meters, and how to stop a machine in an emergency. He showed me where the bathroom was, and where the breaker panel was, and where Albrecht kept the spare log books, in a cabinet on the second floor. He told me which fluorescent tubes were out, so I wouldn't waste time flipping switches that did nothing. Around 4 a.m, he made a final pot of coffee, and we sat in the break room. And he told me about himself a little, the way people do on a night shift when there's nothing else to fill the silence. He had a daughter who'd moved across the country. He'd worked at a factory before the factory closed, which was the same factory that had closed for everybody in that town. The single event that the whole place was still organized around. He'd taken the Heartline job because it was the only thing hiring, and the only thing he was qualified for, which wasn't much because the job didn't require much. He said he'd planned to stay a year, and it had been 11. Why'd you stay? I asked. He was quiet for a while. It's hard to explain, he said finally. You get into the rhythm of it, and after a while, you feel like... He stopped, started again. You feel like the job needs somebody who knows how it works, somebody who follows the rules. You start to feel like if you left, they'd put some kid in here who didn't follow them, and something would go wrong, and it'd be your fault for leaving. He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. That's stupid. It's a night security job, basically, but that's how you start to feel. I didn't understand what he meant. I do now. My first solo night was the following Monday. Petrosian had worked alongside me for 4 nights total. And on the 4th night, Albrecht came up around midnight. Watched me start and monitor a transfer, asked me to recite the 5 rules, which I did, and told me I was cleared to work alone. Petrosian shook my hand on the way out and said, "Just follow the rules and you'll be fine. All 5 of them, even the dumb one." He meant the phone. I said I would. The first few solo weeks were exactly as boring as advertised, and I was grateful for it. I'd come in at 10, relieve nobody because there was nobody on the shift before me, check the queue at Station 2, and find 2 or 3 or 4 transfer cards waiting for me. I'd start the first transfer at its scheduled time, sit and watch the meters, write nominal in the anomaly column when it finished, and wait for the next one. In the gaps, I read, or I walked the floor to stay awake, or I sat in the break room drinking terrible coffee and looking at my phone, which got no signal in most of the building. So really, I just looked at photos I'd already seen and the same 3 apps. The transfers themselves were strange in an interesting way at first. I started listening to them, despite Petrosian's warning making me a little nervous. Because there was nothing else to do, and the headphones were right there. Most of them were dull, a recording of a lecture from 1958, a church choir, a man reading stock prices, a wax cylinder of someone practicing the same piano scale over and over with long pauses where I imagined a teacher correcting them. But some were strange and beautiful in a way I wasn't expecting. There was a recording of a woman singing in a language I didn't know, her voice swimming up out of a sea of hiss and crackle, breaking apart and reforming. And I sat there, with the headphones on, and felt something I didn't have a word for. The medium was failing as it played. I was hearing this woman's voice for what was, in a real sense, the last time it would ever exist in that form. After my pass, the original would be too degraded to play, and only the digital copy would remain. And the digital copy is never quite the same. There's something about hearing a thing once, knowing it's the last time, that gives it a weight. I started to like the job. I want that on the record too. For about 3 weeks, I liked it. I liked the quiet. I liked the strangeness of the recordings. I liked that I was being paid and could pay my rent. I liked the feeling of being the only person awake in a building full of the captured voices of the dead. It felt like meaningful work in a way that the jobs I'd had before, warehouse, delivery, a brief and humiliating stint in a call center, never had. The first thing that was wrong, I almost didn't notice. It was a logbook. I was filling out a line one night, copying the source ID off the card, and I had to flip back a few pages to check something. I don't even remember what. The format of how I'd written a previous entry, something trivial. And I noticed that the source IDs followed a pattern. They were all in the format of a year, a dash, and then a number. Like 1931-044 or 1957-112. The year, I'd assumed, was the year the recording was made. That made sense for an archive. But there were transfers from the same source IDs, weeks apart, in the log. The same exact ID, transferred more than once. I'd transferred 1931-044 myself, I was fairly sure, and here it was 3 weeks earlier in a different hand, the night tech before me, also transferred. And the rule was that each source could only be played once, before the medium failed. Petrosian had been very clear about that. One pass. That was the whole reason I was there, to make sure nothing went wrong on the one and only pass a recording would ever get. So how had 1931-044 been transferred twice? I told myself there was an explanation. Maybe the ID wasn't unique to a physical object. Maybe it was a project number, and multiple recordings shared it. Maybe the first transfer had failed and they'd had a second copy. Maybe I was misremembering, which, given my memory, was entirely possible. I went back to work, but I started watching the IDs after that, and the pattern held. Over the next week, 3 different sources I transferred had already appeared in the log, weeks earlier. Same ID. Played once, then played again. The second thing I noticed was about the cards. The transfer cards, the little index cards clipped to the station that told me what to play and when. They were filled out by the day staff in pencil, and they listed the source ID, the medium, the start time, and any notes. I'd been assuming the day staff prepared them in the afternoon before they left, since the transfers were always loaded and ready when I arrived. But one night, I came in early, around 9:30, because I couldn't sleep and figured I might as well. And the transfer room was empty, and there were no cards at Station 2. The station was bare. No card, no loaded source, nothing. I figured the day staff just hadn't gotten to it yet, or that there were no transfers scheduled that night, which would have been a first but wasn't impossible. I made coffee. I read for a while. And when I came back to the station around 10:15, there was a card clipped to it, and a wire spool loaded on the appropriate machine, and the card listed a start time of 10:40 p.m. Nobody had come in. I'd been in the break room, which was right next to the transfer room, with both doors open the whole time. I'd have heard the elevator. I'd have heard footsteps on that linoleum, which announced everyone who walked on it. I'd heard nothing. I stood there holding the card, and I felt the first real prickle of something being wrong. The first crack in the comfortable story I'd been telling myself about this place. And then I did what I always do, which is I came up with an explanation that let me keep going. The day staff, I decided, must prepare the transfers in the morning and stage them somewhere. And there must be a system, an automated one, maybe, a cart on a timer, something that brought them out to the station. It was a high-tech archive, after all. There was equipment here I didn't understand. Why not a system for staging transfers? It was a stretch, but it was less of a stretch than the alternative, which was a thing I wasn't willing to look at directly yet. I ran the transfer. It was a wire recording, 1944-019, and I listened to it. And it was a man's voice reading what sounded like a list of names, just names, one after another, with a pause between each. The audio quality was poor, lots of hiss, and the names were hard to make out. And after a while, I stopped trying to follow them and just let it wash over me. The transfer ran 51 minutes. I wrote nominal in the log, though I remember pausing over that word, because a man reading a list of names for 51 minutes did not feel nominal. It felt strange, but it wasn't an anomaly in the sense Petrosian had meant the machine had behaved normally. The source had survived the pass. Nothing had gone mechanically wrong. So, nominal. I want to describe the building at night, because the building is part of this, the way it felt at 3 a.m. when I was the only one in it. It was never fully quiet. There was the hum from the transfer room, the equipment, which I got so used to that I only noticed it when it changed, which it did sometimes, dropping in pitch for no reason I could see and then climbing back. There was the building itself settling and ticking the way old buildings do. There was the wind, when there was wind, finding its way through the narrow windows and the gaps around the doors. And there was, underneath all of it, a sound I could never quite locate. A kind of low intermittent knocking that I told myself was the pipes. Old buildings have pipes that knock. That's a real thing. But this knocking didn't have the rhythm of pipes, the water hammer pattern of pressure releasing. It was slower and more irregular, and it seemed to come from below me, from the lower floors, the closed ones, behind the east stairwell door. I never went to check it. The 4th rule said keep the east stairwell door closed always, and I followed that rule, not because I was disciplined, but because I had no desire whatsoever to open a door onto a dark, closed basement at 3 a.m. to investigate a knocking sound. Some rules you don't have to be told twice. The smell got stronger as the weeks went on, or I got more sensitive to it. That cool, mineral basement flood smell I'd noticed on my first day. It was strongest near the east stairwell door and near Station 1, and I started to avoid Station 1 a little, sitting at the far end of the room when I could, which was easy because I worked at Station 2 anyway. About 5 weeks in, the phone rang. I'd almost forgotten about the phone. The 5th rule, the dumb one, as Petrosian had called it. The phone at Station 1 that wasn't connected to anything. It had sat there silent for 5 weeks, just an old yellow phone gathering dust. And I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing any object that never does anything. It was a little after 2 a.m. I was at Station 2, between transfers, reading. And the phone rang. I want to describe the sound because it wasn't what I expected. I'd been picturing vaguely the harsh electronic ring of a modern phone, or maybe the loud mechanical bell of an old one. This was neither. It was a bell, yes, the real bell of an old rotary phone, but it was muffled, distant sounding, as though I was hearing it through a wall or from the far end of a long hallway, even though it was 20 feet away from me in the same room. It rang once, a full long ring, and then a pause, and then again. I sat very still. My heart was going hard, harder than the situation seemed to call for, because rationally it was just a phone ringing and I'd been told it would happen. But there's a difference between being told a thing and having it happen. And the difference is your body, which doesn't care what you've been told. My body knew, before I did, that an unplugged phone ringing in an empty building at 2 a.m. was wrong in a way that no explanation about induced current could fix. I did what I'd been trained to do. I picked up my pen, and I wrote in the log, in the anomaly column of the current line, Phone S1 rang, 2:07 a.m. My hand was not steady. The writing came out cramped. It rang again, and again. It didn't stop after a few rings, the way Petrosian had implied. It kept going, that muffled distant bell, ring and pause, and I sat there counting, because counting gave me something to do. And I got to 14, and then I lost count. And then I just sat there, with my pen in my hand, listening to it ring. It rang, I think, for almost 10 minutes. I know that's a long time. I know it sounds like an exaggeration. I looked at the clock when it started, and I looked at the clock when it stopped, and there were 9 minutes between. And in those 9 minutes, the phone rang what must have been 40 or 50 times, with that same patient rhythm, ring and pause, like whoever was calling knew someone was there and was prepared to wait. I did not answer it. I want to be clear about that. The 5th rule was the one rule I'd never been tempted to break, and I didn't break it that night. I sat at Station 2 with the headphones off and my book closed in my lap. And I waited for it to stop. And eventually it stopped. And the silence after it stopped was worse than the ringing had been. Because in the silence, I had to think about what had just happened. When it was over, I got up and walked to Station 1, which I'd been avoiding. And I looked at the phone. It sat there, yellow and silent and dusty, the frayed cord trailing off the back of the desk into nothing. I crouched down and followed the cord with my eyes to make sure I hadn't missed something, that it wasn't secretly plugged in somewhere. It wasn't. The cord ended in a stub of frayed wire 8 inches from the back of the phone. There was no power going to it. There was no possible way for it to ring. I stood there for a long time. And then I don't know why I did this, except that I needed to do something with my hands. The way I always do, I picked up the receiver, not to talk into it, just to lift it, to break the connection, to make sure it couldn't ring again. I lifted the receiver to my ear, the way you do automatically, a habit older than the phone itself. There was a sound on the line. I should not have heard anything. There was no line. But when I put that receiver to my ear, there was a sound, faint, far away. And it took me a moment to understand what I was hearing. And when I understood it, I put the receiver back down. So fast it clattered. It was the sound of a room. An empty room with that particular quality, a sort of soft, enormous quiet, with the faintest reverberation in it, the sound of space. And in the room, far away, getting no closer, there was someone breathing. I went back to Station 2, and I sat down. And I did not get up again until the sky started to gray outside the narrow windows. I didn't run the last transfer on the card that night. I couldn't make myself walk back across the room to the machine. In the morning, I wrote on the card, in pencil, "Transfer not run equipment issue," which was a lie, and I left it for the day staff, and I went home and slept badly. I should have quit, I know that. Anyone listening to this is thinking it right now. That was the moment. That was when any sensible person would have called Albrecht and said he wasn't coming back. But I want you to understand where I was. Rent was due in 9 days. The job paid better than anything else I could find, and it had taken me 14 months to find it. And I'd convinced myself, by the time I woke up that afternoon, that I'd been tired and frightened, and that the breathing had been my own, picked up by the receiver somehow, or the building's ventilation, or nothing at all, a sound I'd assembled out of silence the way the brain assembles voices out of hiss. Pareidolia. Petrosian had even given me the word for it. I had a word for it, so I had a way to file it away, and I filed it away, and I went back the next night. The next night, the phone didn't ring, and the night after that it didn't either. And I started to relax again, the way you do, the way the human mind smooths over anything if you give it enough uneventful hours. I ran my transfers, I logged them nominal, I drank the coffee. I avoided Station 1, but I no longer felt afraid of it, just wary, the way you're wary of a dog that bit you once, but seems fine now. And then one night, I needed a fresh logbook, because the one I'd been using was nearly full. And I went down to the second floor to the cabinet where Albrecht kept the spares, and I found something I wasn't supposed to find. The cabinet was a tall gray metal thing, the kind with double doors and a latch, standing against the wall in a second-floor office that the day staff used, and I never did. Albrecht had shown me where it was during training. I opened it, expecting to find a stack of blank log books. And there were blank log books, on the middle shelves, a dozen of them, shrink-wrapped in pairs. But on the bottom shelf, lying flat, were the old log books, the full ones, the completed records, going back, I realized, as I crouched down and looked at them. Years and years. There were maybe 40 of them, stacked in 2 piles, the spines facing out, each one labeled with a range of dates on a piece of masking tape. I should have just taken a fresh book and gone back upstairs. But I'm curious, I've said that. It's one of my flaws. And there's something about a record of a place you work going back before you that's hard to resist. So I pulled out the oldest looking one, a book with a cracked cloth cover and a date on the tape that I put it about 9 years back. And I opened it. It was the same format. Source ID, medium, start time, motor speed, anomaly, action, initials. Line after line of transfers, most of them logged nominal, in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I flipped through it, and every so often, scattered through the nominal entries, there was a line in the anomaly column that wasn't nominal. And those lines were always some version of the same thing. Phone S1 rang, 11:52 p.m. Phone S1 rang, 3:14 a.m. long. Phone S1 rang. Did not answer. I flipped faster. The phone rang in this book, the one from 9 years ago, just like it rang for me. Once a week, maybe less, exactly as Petrosian had said. Whoever the night tech had been 9 years ago had logged it the same way I did, time and brief note, and kept working. But there was something else in that book. And this is the part I keep coming back to, the part that made it impossible for me to keep telling myself the comfortable story. The handwriting changed. About 2/3 of the way through that 9-year-old book, the handwriting changed. The way it does when one person stops working a job and another person starts. The first handwriting, the one that had logged all those phone calls, just stopped, mid-book, at the bottom of a page. And the next page started in a new hand. New person, new night tech. And the first thing the new night tech wrote, before any transfer, before any nominal, on the first line of his first night, he didn't write a transfer at all. He wrote a note across the columns, ignoring the format, in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper. And the note said, "Asked Albrecht where Kay went. He said Kay transferred to days. There are no days. I've worked here 4 months, and I have never once seen the day staff." The cards write themselves. Check the cards. Watch who fills out the cards. I read it 3 times. Then I looked at the date on the masking tape, did the arithmetic, and felt the floor of my stomach drop, because I realized I knew that handwriting. The hard-pressed pencil, denting the paper. I'd seen it before. It was on an index card in my pocket. The card with the 5 rules written out. The card a heavy-set man with a gray mustache had handed me on my first night and told me to follow all 5, even the dumb one. It was Petrosian's handwriting. Petrosian, who had told me the day staff prepared the transfers. Petrosian, who had explained the phone with a story about induced current. Petrosian, who had worked here 11 years and told me he stayed because he felt the job needed someone who followed the rules. He'd written 9 years ago, on his first night, "There are no days. The cards write themselves." And then he'd worked here for 9 more years, logging the phone calls, telling each new night tech the same comfortable lies he'd been told, until he handed the job to me. I closed the book. I put it back on the bottom shelf, exactly where it had been, lined up with the others. And I took a fresh logbook from the middle shelf, and my hands were doing that thing again, where they need something normal to do. So I squared the edges of the stack twice, 3 times, long after they were squared. Then I went back upstairs to Station 2, where a transfer was waiting that I didn't remember being there when I left. With a card clipped to it in pencil that nobody had walked up those stairs to deliver, listing a source ID I would later wish I had never read, and a start time of 4 a.m., which was 11 minutes away. I sat down at Station 2 and looked at the card and told myself the only thing that would let me keep sitting there, which was that Petrosian had been having a breakdown 9 years ago. That was the explanation I built in the 11 minutes I had before the start time. People crack on night shifts. The isolation does things. He'd been new and scared, and he'd written something paranoid in the log, the way a person does when they're not sleeping right. And then he'd gotten his footing and worked 9 more years and turned into the calm, tired man who'd handed me an index card and told me to follow the rules. The note didn't mean the day staff were imaginary. It meant a frightened man had once believed they were. Those aren't the same thing, I almost convinced myself. I want you to understand how badly I wanted to. Because the alternative was that I'd taken a job that didn't have a daytime, in a building where the work scheduled itself, and that I'd been doing that work for 2 months without asking the one question that mattered, which was who, exactly, I was doing it for. The card said 1944-019. I recognized it. I'd run that one already. The list of names, the man's voice reading them one after another for 51 minutes. I'd logged it nominal. And here it was again, loaded on the wire machine, scheduled for 4 a.m., a recording that by the rules of the place could only be played once before the medium failed. I'd transferred it 3 weeks ago. It should have been dead. It should have been a degraded spool sitting in some archive box, good for nothing but the digital copy. Instead, it was threaded up and waiting. And a card I hadn't written said to play it again. I didn't play it. That was the second protocol I broke after the lie I'd written the night of the phone. I sat there and I watched the clock go to 4 o'clock and past it. 4:01, 4:02. and I did not press start. And nothing happened. No alarm, no consequence. The machine just sat there with its reel still. I felt almost giddy with it, the way you feel when you've been bracing for a slap that doesn't land. See, I told myself, nothing. You can just not do it. It's just a job. At 4:09, the phone at Station 1 rang. I knew this time what it was. I knew it the way you know your own name. The card said play the recording at 4, and I hadn't. And now the phone was ringing. And the two things were connected, and the connection was the whole architecture of the place, revealing itself to me a piece at a time. The ringing wasn't random. The ringing was what happened when the work didn't get done. I wrote in the log, with a hand that had gone cold, phone S1 rang, 4:09 a.m. And then, because Petrosian's note was burning a hole in my pocket, and I was done pretending, I added something I had no business adding, the first real anomaly I'd ever written in full. Phone rings when transfer was skipped, connected, and I sat there while it rang. The muffled, distant bell, ring and pause, patient. And this time, I understood the patience. It wasn't waiting for me to answer. It was waiting for me to do the work. I got up. I walked to the wire machine. And I pressed start. The ringing stopped on the first note of the recording, cut off clean, the way a held breath stops. And the man's voice came up out of the hiss and began to read names. I put the headphones on. I don't know why. I'd spent 2 months mostly not listening. And now, the one night I should have walked out the door, I sat down and put the heavy old headphones over my ears and listened to a recording I'd already heard. And that's the part I can't forgive myself for. Because if I hadn't listened, I wouldn't have heard what was different. It was different. The first time I'd run 1944-019, it had been a list of strangers, names that meant nothing, a wash of vowels and hiss. This time, I listened to the names. Maybe because I was finally paying attention. Maybe because something wanted me to. The voice read them slowly, with that pause between each. And they were old names, the kind you see on gravestones in the oldest part of a cemetery. And then about 20 minutes in, the voice said a name I knew. It said Petrosian. Not the first name I'd have expected, not Gregor, which was his first name. I'd seen it on the schedule. It said the surname, and then a first initial, and then it paused. The same pause it gave every name, and went on to the next one. I sat very still. I told myself it was a common enough name, that there could have been a Petrosian in 1944 who had nothing to do with the tired man who'd trained me. I told myself the brain hears what it's looking for. Pareidolia. I had the word. I reached for the word. But I'd seen his note. I knew there were no days. And a recording that should have been played once was playing for the second time, with my coworker's name in it. A name that had not been in it 3 weeks ago when I'd run it the first time and heard only strangers. The recording ran 51 minutes, the same as before. I let it finish. I didn't write anything this time. I left the anomaly column blank because I didn't have words for what to put there. And a blank line in that log is its own kind of confession. And I think, on some level, I wanted it left blank. Wanted there to be a gap in the record that matched the gap opening up in me. I didn't go home when the sky grayed. I waited. The day staff started at 8, supposedly. And I had never once stayed to see them, because my shift ended at 6, and I was always too tired to do anything but leave. But that morning, I made a fresh pot of terrible coffee, and I sat in the break room with the door open, and I watched the hallway. And I waited to see a single person walk in to start the day shift. Nobody came. 8 o'clock came and went. 8:30. The light through the narrow windows went from gray to a thin yellow. At 9, I walked the whole building, every floor I had access to, the first and second and third, and there was no one. The day staff offices were dark. The cabinet on the second floor was exactly as I'd left it. On the desks, there were coffee rings, and family photos and reading glasses and a sweater over the back of a chair. All the debris of people who worked there, except the debris never moved. The same coffee ring, the same sweater. I'd walked past those desks for 2 months and registered them as occupied because they had the props of occupation. And I had never once seen them occupied. And I had never once let myself notice that. K transferred to days. There are no days. I went home and I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment with my unpaid bills on the table, the rent envelope I'd finally been able to fill the week before, the electric bill, the old medical thing from before all this that I'd been paying down $20 at a time. And I thought about Petrosian, who had heard his own name in a recording, who had worked 9 years after writing There Are No Days, and I thought I understood now why he'd stayed. He hadn't stayed because he liked it. He'd stayed because once you know what the phone is, leaving doesn't get you out. It just makes you the person who left. And I thought about how he'd handed me the card and shaken my hand. And I understood that too. And it made me sick because I knew that if I'd been him, I'd have done the same thing. I'd have trained my replacement and let him think it was about induced current. Because the alternative was telling a stranger a thing that would ruin him. And I was already the kind of man who wrote a lie on a card rather than admit he'd skipped a transfer. I am called Petrosian. His number was on the contact sheet in the break room, and I'd taken a photo of it weeks ago for no reason. And I called it from my kitchen at 2 p.m. with my heart going. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The voicemail was the automated kind, the carrier's robot voice reading the number back. No name, no personal greeting. I hung up. I called again. Same thing. I texted, "Need to ask you something about the job. Important. Call me." He never answered. I want to be careful here because I don't actually know what happened to Petrosian, and I've thought about it more than almost anything else. He'd retired, was the official story. He'd put in his 11 years and gone to live near his daughter across the country, Albrecht told me later. When I asked, in the same easy voice he used for everything, "Petrosian's gone to be with family. Good for him. I earned it." And maybe that's true. Maybe he's sitting on a porch somewhere watching his grandkids and screening calls from a number he doesn't recognize, which would be me. I hope that's true. But I heard his name read out of a 1944 wire recording in the voice of a dead man. And I called his phone for a week and got a robot. And I never saw him again. And I've never been able to make those facts sit comfortably together. I went back the next night. Of course I did. I keep saying of course like it explains anything. But the truth is the simplest one, which is that the rent had cleared and the electricity was paid, and I had nowhere else for money to come from. And I had spent 14 months learning exactly how bad it gets when there's no money coming from anywhere. A man who heard what I heard should have walked away. A man 3 weeks behind on rent doesn't have the luxury of being that man. I told myself I'd go back just to understand it, just to look. I told myself a lot of things on the drive over. Albrecht was there when I came in, which was unusual. He was almost never there at night. He was in the break room making coffee in his mended cardigan. And he greeted me like nothing was strange, like it was the most natural thing in the world for him to be at the Heartline Sound Recovery Institute at 10 at night. "You stayed late yesterday," he said. Not a question. He had his back to me, fixing his coffee. "Couldn't sleep," I said. Figured I'd say hi to the day people. Never met them. He turned around and looked at me with those reading glasses pushed up into his hair. And he had the kindest face. That's the thing I keep landing on. He had the face of somebody's grandfather. And he said, "The day staff keep to themselves. It's better that way. You do your part, they do theirs. The building runs because everybody stays in their part of it." He sipped his coffee. "You skipped a transfer the other night. It's 4 o'clock. Road equipment issue." I felt it in my stomach. "The machine was acting up," I said. "It wasn't," he said gently, "the way you correct a child who you both know is lying." The phone rang at 4:09, 9 minutes after the start time. You logged it. Then you ran the transfer late and the phone stopped. He set his cup down. "I'm not angry. I want you to understand that. Everybody tests it once. Petrosian tested it. The fellow before Petrosian tested it. You skip one, you see what happens, and then you understand the job better than any orientation could teach you. So, now you understand it. The phone rings when the work doesn't get done. The work has to get done. That's the whole job. Everything else is detailed." I should have asked him 100 things. Who calls the phone? What the recordings are? Where the day staff are? What happens if the work just never gets done, forever, by anyone? Instead, I asked the smallest question, the cowardly one, the one a man asks when he's already decided to stay and just wants to know the terms. "What happens if I'm sick?" I said. "If I can't come in, nobody's running the transfers then?" Albrecht smiled. And it was a sad smile, and he said, "Then somebody else does the work, or the work doesn't get done. And when the work doesn't get done, the calls come, and the calls have to be answered by someone. And you do not want to be the someone. And you do not want it to be a person you put in that chair without telling them what the chair is." He picked his coffee back up. "You're not the first to figure out the shape of it. You won't be the last. The ones who do best are the ones who stop trying to understand it and just do the work. Understanding doesn't help. It only makes it heavier." That was the most anyone ever explained it to me, and it explained almost nothing. And I think that was deliberate. I think that not explaining was a mercy he'd learned to give. The same mercy Petrosian had given me with the induced current story. They didn't withhold the truth to control me. They withheld it because the truth was a weight, and they were trying, in their broken way, to carry as much of it as they could so that I'd have to carry less. I worked the rest of that night, and I did every transfer on time. 6 of them. It was a heavy night. I didn't listen to any of them. Kept the headphones off. Kept my eyes on the meters. Wrote nominal, nominal, nominal 6 times in a row. And my handwriting got smaller each time. And I understood now why the old logs did that. Why the entries shrank as the books filled. It wasn't that the night techs had less to say. It was that they were trying to take up less space. They were trying not to be noticed by the thing that read the log. Because something read the log. I was sure of it by then. The cards wrote themselves, and the recordings replayed themselves, and the phone rang on a schedule it set. And all of it tracked the work with a precision that meant something was keeping count. And I started to think about the recordings differently. The lists of names. 1944-019. A man reading names with a pause between each. I'd assumed they were archival, historical, somebody's idea of preservation. But what if the recording wasn't old at all? What if the format was a costume? The hiss and the crackle, a kind of disguise. And the thing I was actually doing every night, when I pressed start on a list of names, was reading those names into the world, making them real, the way Petrosian's note said the cards made themselves real, speaking to them. And what if the names that got read were the names of people the building was taking? And the work, the actual work, the thing the phone demanded, was that someone be present to play them, to witness them, to put a living set of ears and a living signature on the act so that it counted. I want to be clear that I don't know that. I'm telling you what I came to believe in the small hours over the weeks that followed. And belief isn't knowledge, and I've been wrong before. But it fits. It fits the way the rules fit. Don't respond to the recording because if you answered, if you spoke back into that list of names, you'd be adding your own. Don't load the second source yourself, because handling the originals was a different and more dangerous degree of involvement than just pressing start. And they wanted to keep me at the shallow end. Keep the east stairwell closed, because whatever the recordings fed, it lived down there, behind that door, in the flooded lower levels. And the knocking I'd heard for 2 months was it. Moving, patient, the same patience as the phone. And the phone itself, the fifth rule, the dumb one. The phone was its voice. The phone was how it called when it was hungry and the work hadn't been done. The breathing I'd heard when I lifted the receiver. The empty room, far away. Someone breathing. I'd put the receiver to my ear, and I'd heard the thing the building negotiated with, on the other end of a line that went nowhere, breathing in a room that didn't exist, waiting. I stayed 5 more weeks. I'm not going to walk you through all of them. They were the same, mostly. The coffee and the meters and the shrinking handwriting, the long quiet, the knocking from below, the phone ringing once that whole stretch on a night I'd run everything on time anyway, which frightened me more than the skipped night had, because it meant the schedule wasn't the only thing that summoned it, or that I'd missed something, or that it just rang sometimes to remind me it could. What ended it was the new guy. Albrecht hired a second night tech in the spring. He told me the workload was increasing, more transfers in the queue, more than one man could run on time, and that I'd be training the new fellow the way Petrosian had trained me. His name was Dell. He was younger than me, mid-20s, and he had the look I must have had when I started, the look of someone who'd been out of work too long and couldn't believe his luck. He had a kid, he told me on his first night, a daughter, 18 months old, and a wife who'd been carrying them both on a pharmacy salary. And he kept saying how much this job was going to help, how he'd been about to lose the apartment, and every word of it was a knife, because I knew what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to hand him an index card and tell him a story about induced current and let him become the next set of ears in the chair. I couldn't do it. I want one thing on the record, just one. And it's that for about a week, I couldn't do it. I trained him on the real parts, the meters and the machines and the log, and when it came to the rules, I gave him the first 4 straight. But on the 5th one, the phone, I hesitated. He asked me, the way I'd asked Petrosian, why an unplugged phone would ring. And I looked at him. This kid with a daughter and an apartment he was about to lose. And I almost told him, I almost said, "Get out. This place is something other than what it says it is. Take your wife and your kid and go." I didn't. Here's the part where I stopped being able to pretend I'm the victim of this story. I didn't tell him, and I'd like to say it was because I knew he wouldn't believe me, or because Albrecht had made clear what happens to people who don't stay in their part of the building. And both of those are true, and both of those are things I told myself. But the real reason, the one underneath, was that if Dell stayed and did the work, then on the nights Dell worked, I didn't have to. 2 techs meant alternating shifts. 2 techs meant that half the time the ears in the chair would be his and not mine. 2 techs meant a buffer, and I wanted the buffer. I'd wanted it from the moment Albrecht said he was hiring, though I hadn't let myself say it that plainly. I gave Dell the induced current story word for word, the way Petrosian gave it to me, and I watched him write it down and nod, and I shook his hand at the end of the week the way I'd been shaken, and I knew exactly what I was doing. And I did it anyway. We alternated. 3 nights with him, 3 nights with me, and Sundays we overlapped to hang out. And for a few weeks, it was almost a relief. Having the load split, having someone to drink the bad coffee with on the overlap nights, hearing him talk about his daughter learning words. He was a good kid. That's not me trying to make it worse, though it does make it worse. He was just a good kid who needed the job, same as me, same as Petrosian, same as the new fellow in Petrosian's note 9 years back. K, who transferred to days, the whole line of us stretching back through that cabinet of log books, each one trained by the last, each one handed the comfortable lie. The night it happened, I wasn't there. That's the thing I have to live with in a particular way. That I wasn't even there. That I was home asleep in my paid-up apartment while it happened on Dell's shift. And I only know what I know from the log and from what I found after. He'd been there for 3 weeks. He'd seen the phone ring twice and logged it the way he'd been taught. Time and brief note. And he'd asked me about it on an overlap night, a little spooked, and I'd given him the line again, the induced current. Told him it was nothing. Told him everybody finds it creepy at first, and then gets used to it. I taught him to get used to it. That was my contribution. I taught a frightened young father to stop being frightened of the exact thing he should have run from. What I think happened, and the log supports the front half of it. And the rest I've assembled. And I could be wrong about pieces of it, is that he got a card that night for a transfer scheduled at a strange hour. And he ran it, and he listened to it. He listened the way I had, the one time it mattered. And I think he heard a name. His daughter's name, or his own, or his wife's, I don't know which. The log doesn't say. The log just has his handwriting running normal and nominal down the page. And then, on the line for that transfer, in the anomaly column, 4 words pressed so hard into the paper they tore it slightly, the same hard pencil pressure Petrosian had, the pressure of a man whose hand has gone tight with fear. This is a name I... And then nothing. The sentence stops there. This is my name I. The line just ends, mid-word almost, mid-thought. And the rest of the page is blank. And the rest of the book is blank. Because Dell never wrote another line. I think he broke the 3rd rule. I think he responded to the recording. He heard the name that mattered to him, and he did the human thing. The thing any of us would do. The thing the rule exists, precisely because we'd all do it. He said something back. Said the name out loud, maybe. Said wait, or no, or who is this, or just made a sound. And I think that's all it takes. I think the rule was never about pareidolia. The rule was that the recording is a list, and an open mouth near a list is a way to get added to it. And Dell opened his mouth. When I came in for my Sunday overlap, he wasn't there. The transfer room was empty. The log was open to that torn line. The phone at Station 1 was off the hook. The receiver was lying on the desk, off its cradle, which I had never once seen, which violated something deep in me to look at. And when I crossed the room and picked it up to set it back, out of that pure reflex to make things normal, I heard the empty room again, the breathing. Except this time, the breathing wasn't far away. It was close. It was right against the other end, fast and shallow, the breathing of someone who has been crying. And under it, very faint, so faint I've spent months trying to convince myself I imagined it. A voice that I knew, that I'd handed an index card to 3 weeks before, saying my name, just my name, asking. The way you say a name into a phone when the line's gone bad and you're not sure anyone's still there. I put the receiver back on the cradle. I want to tell you I said something to him. That I said, "I'm sorry, I'm here, I'll get you out." I didn't. I put the receiver down, and I stepped back from the desk, and I stood in the middle of that room with my hands shaking, and I did the math. The same math I think every one of us does at this point, the math Petrosian did and Kay did and all of them did, which is, there is nothing I can do for him. And if I make noise, if I respond, if I pick that receiver back up and answer, I go where he went. The rule is don't answer. The rule was always don't answer. And the only thing worse than a man who lets it happen is a man who follows him in for nothing. So I didn't answer. I let the phone sit. And I have told myself 1,000 times that there was genuinely nothing to be done, that he was already gone, that answering would only have made it 2 instead of 1. And I think all of that is true. And I also know that I was relieved, in a small, cold place I don't like to look at, that it had been his shift and not mine, that the buffer had worked, that the thing I'd wanted when I let Albrecht hire him, the thing I'd never said out loud, had come true exactly as I'd have hoped it would. He'd been between me and it, and he still was. Albrecht came in that morning. I'd called him, and he came. And he looked at the log and the off-hook phone, and he didn't seem surprised. He seemed sad. The patient sadness of a man who's seen this enough times to have stopped expecting otherwise. He set the receiver right where I'd already set it. He closed the log, and he said, "Did you answer it?" "No," I said. "Good," he said. "That's good. That's the right thing." And he meant it. That was the worst part. He was comforting me, telling me I'd done the right. And the thing he was comforting me for was standing in a room listening to a young father say my name through a phone and choosing to put it down. You did everything correctly. There was nothing else to do. I want you to hear me say that, because you're going to need to have heard it. There was nothing else to do. He told me Dell had quit. That was the story. Couldn't handle nights, gave no notice, just stopped showing up. It happens with the young ones. He'd handle the paperwork. He'd tell the wife if the wife called. I should put it out of my mind. And then he said the thing I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. The thing that I now understand is the final step, the thing that gets done to all of us once we've stayed past the point of leaving. He offered me Petrosian's old role, senior night tech. A raise, a real one, the first real raise I'd seen in years. Enough that the unpaid medical thing would finally clear. Enough that I'd stop screening calls from the number I'd memorized. And with it, the responsibility of training the next one. Because there'd be a next one. There's always a next one. The queue keeps growing, Albrecht said. The work keeps coming, and the work has to get done. I took it. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it up, because everything else in this account has been me trying to explain myself, and I'm tired of explaining. I took the raise. I took the title. I let Albrecht write up Dell as a no-call, no-show. And when Dell's wife did call the break room number 3 weeks later, a young woman's voice asking, had anyone seen her husband? Did anyone know anything? He'd never come home. The police said adults are allowed to leave. I told her I was sorry, that he'd seemed unhappy on nights, that he'd mentioned wanting to head somewhere warmer, that I didn't know anything more than that. I lied to her with a steadiness that frightened me, because I recognized where I'd learned it. I'd learned it from Albrecht telling me about Petrosian's daughter. I'd learned it from Petrosian telling me about induced current. The lie gets handed down with the index card. It's part of the training. That was almost 2 years ago. I still work there. I run the transfers. I keep the log. I drink the coffee, which is still terrible. And I have trained 2 more people since Dell. and I have given both of them the induced current story. And I have watched them write it down and nod, and I have shaken their hands, and I have wanted, both times, with everything in me, to tell them to run, and I have not, for the same reason, which is the buffer, which is the math, which is the small, cold relief of knowing that, on their nights, it isn't me in the chair. I'm not better than Petrosian. I used to think I'd be different. I'm exactly the same. The chair makes you the same. I'm telling you all of this now for a reason. And the reason is that something changed last week. And I don't have anyone to tell. And I've started to think that writing it down somewhere outside that building might be the only thing I can do that isn't part of the work. Last week, I pulled a fresh logbook from the cabinet. And out of habit, the same curiosity that's never once helped me, I looked at the old ones on the bottom shelf. There are more of them now. The stacks have grown. And I took down the most recent full one, the one before the book I'm writing in now. And I flipped through my own handwriting, page after page of nominal, smaller and smaller. And near the back I found a line I don't remember writing. It's in my hand. I know my own handwriting. It's the cramped, small nominal I've been writing for 2 years. But the line isn't a transfer. In the source ID column, where there should be a year and a number, there's a year and a number, and the year is next year, and I haven't worked next year yet. And in the anomaly column, in my handwriting, pressed hard, the way Petrosian pressed, the way Dell pressed in his last torn line, it says, phone for the senior tech. Answer it. I didn't write that. I'm almost sure I didn't write that. But it's my hand. And the log doesn't lie. The log is the one thing in that building that's truer than memory. And I've spent 2 years learning that when the record and my memory disagree, the record is what's real, and the memory is what gets corrected. The phone hasn't rung for me yet. I've run every transfer on time for 2 years. I've been careful. I've been the best of them, the most precise, the one who never skips, never answers, never speaks near the list. I thought that was protection. I thought if I just did the work perfectly, the call would always be for the work and never for me. But the log says next year there's a call for the senior tech. And I'm the senior tech. And it says, answer it, in my own hand. And I keep thinking about how Petrosian stayed 9 years after he figured out the shape of it. And how he must have found a line like this once, with his name on it, or his role, and how he stayed anyway, and trained me anyway, and handed me the card anyway. And maybe that was the only thing he could do for the people who'd come after him, which was to make sure there'd be someone in the chair when his call came, so that the work would keep getting done, so that it wouldn't be a stranger, so that it would be a man who knew enough to put the receiver down. I haven't quit. The rent's paid. The medical thing finally cleared. I screen no calls anymore, except the ones from a young woman who still phones the break room sometimes, less often now, asking about a husband who headed somewhere warmer. I still tell her I don't know anything. And every night I do the work, on time, every transfer, and I keep the east stairwell closed, and I don't answer the phone, and I wait for the year on that line to come around. And I've started lately, on the long, quiet nights between transfers, to listen to the recordings again, the lists of names. I tell myself I'm listening for Dell or for Petrosian, that if I hear them, I'll know something, though I don't know what I'd do with knowing. But that's not really why I listen. I listen because I want to hear it before it's read by someone else. I want to be the one in the chair when my name comes up in the list. I want to be the ears that witness it. Because the alternative is that some new kid, some good kid with a daughter and an apartment he's about to lose, is sitting in this chair when it happens. and he hears a name that means nothing to him, and presses start and logs it, nominal, and goes home and never knows that the work he did, on time, perfectly, the way I trained him, was me. So I'll be there. I'll do the work. When the phone rings for the senior tech, I'll know it's for me. And I think I've decided, that I'll do what the log says. What my own hand wrote in a year I haven't reached yet. I'll answer it. Not because I want to. Because the only thing worse than going where Dell went is making someone else put the receiver down on me and live with it. The way I've lived with it. The way Petrosian lived with it. The way every name on every list once lived with something before it became a name. The coffee's still terrible. The microwave still doesn't work. Nobody's reported it. We work around it. That's the philosophy of the whole building. And it turns out it's the philosophy of the whole thing. All the way down to whatever's breathing in that room at the other end of a line that goes nowhere. You don't report it. You don't fix it. You just keep the work getting done, and you stay in your part of the building. And you hand the card to the next one with a story about induced current. And you hope, the way I'm hoping now, writing this where I shouldn't, that somewhere outside the building there's still such a thing as a day